Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be looking at some of my reading statistics for the year. The stats that I'm going to be looking at are from the beginning of the year, January, all the way until basically the end of July. I still have a day and a half left of July, so maybe I'll finish another book, but I doubt it's going to impact the stats that I have that seriously. So I'm going to be looking at the stats for the books that I read the first 7 months of the year. I'm going to break it down, look at genre, look at representation, and then at the end I'm going to set some kind of general goals for myself and how to better read what I want to be reading. So now I did just want to say, in this video, I am breaking down representation that's in the books that I'm reading, and I think that having diverse representation, reading diverse authors, is super important. However, that is just a small piece of what we need to be doing in general. I'm talking about my books because it's my booktube channel. That's what everybody's here for. But while we're reading all of these diverse books, we need to be sure that we are internalizing them. We need to be sure that we're using them. We shouldn't be reading a book by a Black author just to check it off a list. We shouldn't be reading a queer book just so that we can look woke. If you aren't taking what you're reading, learning it, and using it in your life somehow, you're kind of wasting your time. It's a little bit harsh, but it's kind of true. If you aren't reading diversely in order to help in some way the people who you're reading about, what's the point of reading? Obviously we can't be on top of every single issue. Not everyone can be spread that thin, but at the very least, you should be looking at yourself and the individual biases that you have and use your reading to do that work. If you have the opportunity to do it in other ways as well, such as incorporating it in the workplace, for me, this is a little bit easier because I'm a sociologist and I do gender studies. Not everyone can incorporate it in such a cut and dry way. If you work in a desk job filing papers, certainly how you incorporate that is going to look differently than how I incorporate that. But if nothing else, it can help you relate to other people on a personal level. But again, that requires that internal work. And I think this is important to acknowledge when we're having these conversations about, oh, what books are we reading? Because this isn't just supposed to be performative. If you're interested in diversifying your reading experience, you should use that for something. This isn't to like make anybody feel bad, but I just thought that I would put that out there, especially since I am literally breaking down everything into percentages. I didn't want to make it seem like we should be like reaching for a certain percentage, because the numbers don't really matter if you don't use what you're reading anyways, in that sort of way. Now, these statistics are going to be on books that I have read and finished, so not including the ones that I'm currently reading or part of the way through, and this is also going to be by book count, not page count. So to start off with, about a third of what I've read has been nonfiction. I could see that on Storygraph, but I also made my own spreadsheet because I wanted to look at some other things as well. And from my count, about 39% are nonfiction, so that's about right. I did have 3 that were not quite fiction, not quite nonfiction. A lot of those are fiction that's slightly autobiographical, like Stone Butch Blues or Freshwater. Another thing that I got from Storygraph is that about 3/4 of what I've been reading have been 300 pages or less, so I've not been reading a lot of big books. The thing with that is that I've been reading a lot of big books, but I've not been finishing a lot of big books, and that needs to change. Hopefully this month will help that at least a little bit with the tome topple. And then so far as the mood of what I read, a decent chunk of what I read is emotional, which is to be expected. And then the next moods that are sort of tied are reflective books, lighthearted books, and challenging books, which is interesting since lighthearted and challenging are very different. So it seems like I've got a mix of emotions there. Really, the rest of what I have is from my own personal spreadsheet, so hopefully all of these numbers will be right. I had a little bit of a time because I'm using a program that I'm not used to, but it's fine. About 29% of what I've read has been young adult, and only 5% has been middle grade, leaving kidlit with 3%. And then the rest are just general or adult. So far as more specific genres go, I think I've got a decent mix. A lot of them I wasn't really sure how to categorize, so about 30% of the books that I've read I put as just general fiction, but I've got a pretty good mix between memoir, general poetry, general nonfiction, romance, and sci-fi fantasy. I was actually surprised that I've read slightly more sci-fi fantasy than I have romance. Romance here is not just adult romance. For that, I've probably only read 2. But I'm including young adult romance and graphic novels that are more romance-oriented. And I kind of thought that I would have had more of those than sci-fi fantasy, but apparently not. So far as format goes, about 24% of what I've read have been graphic novels, and an additional 13% have been manga, meaning that 37% of what I've read has been in some sort of graphic format. About 16% of the books that I've read have been poetry, and then 31% have just been kind of your typical, like, novel or storyline setup, whether fiction or nonfiction, and then the rest of them have been a variety of other formats like plays or essays. About 16% of what I've read has been translated. 13% of that is from Japanese, and I would say that most, if not all of that, is probably manga. And then the other 3% include my 2 readings of Blue is the Warmest Color and Fragments of Sappho. I also broke down my nonfiction specifically by topic. About 60% of the nonfiction that I've read this year deals with LGBT topics, about 23% deal with race, and 14% with disability. Other topics that are covered in my nonfiction with just 1 or 2 texts include feminism, history, immigration, the environment, and just general poetry. Next, we can move on to representation. Now, with these numbers for queer representation, I included books that had queer content, as well as books that had queer authors that I knew of. I honestly don't think that there were more than maybe 1 or 2 books that didn't have queer content that did have queer authors that I knew of. With all that being said, 70% of the books that I read had LGBT representation, and then an additional 7% on top of that had some background queer characters, even if they weren't central to the story. If you break it down, about 41% of the books that I read had some sort of sapphic characters, and about 15% had some sort of gay, bisexual, or otherwise queer male characters. There's another 8% that kind of just had general queer identities. Some of that included things that might have not focused on sexuality, but there were trans characters in it. And then an additional 2% of what I read in total had asexuality within the books. Now, this is somewhere that I definitely want to improve on because that 2% was literally, that's just 2 books. So far as other kind of specific labels go, about 10% of the books that I read had a character who was bisexual and said on the page that they were specifically bisexual. And then about 19% of the books that I've read have characters who are lesbians. Now, there were a couple of those that might have not said the word lesbian on page, but in those books, it seemed super clear to me that the main character was lesbian. Like, for instance, in Kase-san and Yamada, Kase-san, I don't think, says straight out that she's lesbian, but she is only ever with girls and doesn't have any interest in boys. She's never dated boys, and there's no indication of that. So I would just assume that she's a lesbian. So in cases like that, I've included maybe a couple of books that they don't say it on the page, but the vast majority of them do. Kind of in the realm of sexuality, there's also polyamorous representation, and so far as that goes, I only read 3 books with polyamorous characters, and only one of them had like a main character who was polyamorous, and I would like to fix that. I would like to get more books with that rep. So far as trans representation goes, about 30% of the books that I've read have trans characters sort of in the forefront of the story, so as main characters or secondary characters that you see a lot. So that's anybody across kind of the trans spectrum. About 15% of the books that I've read all year have non-binary characters. And then that other 15% is split up between trans men, trans women, and people who are questioning. There were also some books that had multiple trans characters in it. And then from here, I also wanted to talk about the kind of gender and sexuality breakdown of the authors. I will say that this is just from the information that was readily available on the internet. I tried to look up like a little bit with some of the authors who wrote, especially those who wrote queer stories. But honestly, most of the authors, I'm really not sure what their sexuality is or if they have any other kind of gender identity, because a lot of the times when people are cis and straight, they don't come out and say, I'm cis and straight. You just have to assume that. So there is a chance that some of these authors just aren't out, which is completely valid. But going off of what I do know, about 53% of the books that I read were written by female authors. About 25% were written by non-binary authors, and 22% were written by men. Overall, about 28% of the books that I read were written by trans or non-binary people. I will say that in addition to this, there was one book that had a non-binary person as the secondary author, so that's not included in this. And then there are 2 books that were anthologies that included trans people, so they are not included in those numbers either. And then going into books with multiple authors, about 52% of the books that I had that had multiple authors, women were listed as the first author, so the primary author. About 38% of them had men listed as the primary author, and then 10% had non-binary people as the primary author. And I think that was only one book. Now I've got to say those numbers do look pretty good, and having read more books by non-binary people than by men was pretty neat. However, I did want to take into account the fact that in June I only read books by trans authors. So I also looked at the data that I had, taking out the month of June. So excluding the month of June, about 59% were written by women, 22% were written by men, and only 18% were by non-binary people. That's still probably better than most people, but I kind of like the other numbers better. With that as well, about 21% of the authors were trans overall. So far as LGBT status overall goes, like I said, not everybody is out, but from what I got, about 50% of the books that I've read were authored by LGBT people. And then there's an additional 10% that I couldn't find whether or not they were LGBT, but judging by their writing, I would be really surprised if they weren't, or there were little bits and pieces where they like hinted at it. I don't like the idea of really like speculating on other people's sexuality. However, the people who are more ambiguous, I didn't want to say, okay, well, they're just straight. So I kind of put some in another category. Regardless, 50% of the authors that I read were definitely LGBT. Next, I'm going to talk about the breakdown of race within what I read. First, I'm going to talk about what the breakdown looks like within fiction, and then I'm going to talk about looking at the authors as a whole. Within the fiction that I read, about 32% had main characters that were white. About 32% had main characters that were black, and then about 29% had characters that were Asian. I only had one character that was Native American, and then there were 2 books, both kids' books, that had kind of a mix of main characters. Like there were 1 or 2 like little kids that were on the page that were all a little bit different, but this is not necessarily considering side characters. So looking at the racial breakdown of authors, it might add up to a little bit more than 100%, and that's because there were some authors with multiple racial identities, so I ended up putting them in both categories. So far as authors go, about 44% of the books that I've read have been written by white authors, about 30% by black authors, and 24% by Asian authors. But after that point, it gets pretty sad looking. I have only read 3 books by Indigenous authors this year, and 2 by Latinx authors. So that's clearly a glaring hole in my reading. Additionally, there are certain aspects of some of the other representation that could be better. With the books that I've read by Asian authors, there's not a whole lot of diversity within that. About 18% of the books that I've read overall have been by Japanese authors, which leaves 5% of the authors that I've read that were South Asian authors. Looking in general at Asia, or even just South Asia, there's so much diversity within that, you know, that's not really that big of a scope of books to look at. So that's definitely an area that I could look at to improve as well. But with all of this information, I wanted to do kind of similar to what I did with the breakdown for trans authors. I wanted to take out February, because during February I read almost exclusively Black authors, with the exception of some kids' books that I had to read for work. So if I look at all of the months except for February, I have 52% of the books that I'm reading that are by white authors, and then 15% by Black authors. So that's not really great. Looking at kind of where the people that I'm reading come from, this is only considering kind of the country that they've lived in most recently. So there are some authors, for instance, that like migrated from one country to another. I was only considering the country that they were living in when they were writing. So about 72% of the writers that I read are from the United States, 13% are from Japan, and then 5% Canada, 1% Australia, and then the rest are from European countries. So there's clear room for improvement there. I'm reading a lot of American books. And the final kind of piece that I'm going to be looking at so far as representation goes is disability representation. In the actual books that I read, both fiction and nonfiction, about 12% of them talked about disability in some capacity. This included things like HIV, general physical disabilities, cancer, and then I read one book with a hard of hearing character. And then if you look at issues of mental illness, about 29% of the books that I read dealt with mental illness. The vast majority of them was kind of like depression, anxiety, or general mental health, but there were a fair amount of them that also dealt with trauma, a couple that dealt with addiction, suicide, and eating disorders, and then I only read one with representation for someone who had bipolar disorder and one for somebody who had dissociative identity disorder. And then kind of along the same vein, I also wanted to talk about autism representation. I only read 3 books that had any kind of autism rep, and 2 of those were during an autism readathon. So that's clearly an area that I need improvement with. And then finally, I also looked at the authors and whether or not they had disabilities. Now with this, again, it's hard to know what author has a disability and what author doesn't, because not everyone talks about them, especially if they have an invisible disability, especially when there are some authors that don't really say that much about themselves in general. But from the information that I could gather online, only about 10% of the authors that I read had disabilities. Most of them had some sort of chronic illnesses, and then there were also a few that had specifically cancer and HIV. And then of the authors that I read, only 3 of them were autistic. So that is the spread for what I've been reading. There are some good things going on, and there are definitely some less than good things going on. So I want to talk a little bit about what I'm planning to do in hopes of diversifying my reading a little bit more. So to start off with, I definitely want to read more nonfiction. I know a third is big for some people, but I really like reading nonfiction, and it is also helpful for me, like on a professional level too, to tie that into another goal that I should probably set in regards to making my bookshelf less unread. I want to try to work on at least 2 books per month that are on my topical TBRs, at least 2. And I also want to have a focus on finishing what's been started. So in maybe September or October, I'll have some sort of initiative to finish a lot of the things that I have going. And then I have one more goal as far as genre goes. I didn't necessarily have a problem with my breakdown of adult versus young adult and all of that. I would like a little bit more middle grade, but I don't know how feasible it is for me to add that. However, I do want to read at least one of my unread YA books that are sitting on my shelf per month. If you saw my bookshelf tour, you probably would have noticed the fact that I have just a ridiculous amount of unread YA books. So that's something else that I want to do. So far as representation goes, I definitely need to find books with more asexual characters and more polyamorous characters. I don't have a specific number goal for that, especially because I don't own a ton of those books. I know, for instance, I am going to be reading Radio Silence, which has some demisexual representation, and I really want to get Loveless. But as far as polyamorous rep goes, I'm really kind of at a loss. So I'm going to be doing some researching and thinking on that. The next thing that I want to be sure to do is to prioritize Latinx and Indigenous works. I probably need to get more, but honestly, I know that I have some unread Indigenous and Latinx authors sitting on my shelves, so I'll definitely get to those first, and then go about finding more. I'm going to set kind of a minimum for myself. Each of my monthly TBRs needs to have at least 2 books by Indigenous authors and 2 books by Latinx authors. I'm not saying that I'm going to have only 2, but I'm saying that 2 is the baseline standard that I'm putting for myself. Additionally, while I'm doing that, I want to be sure that I'm not just replacing kind of other books of color with these. I want to be sure that I'm maintaining or reading more books by other sorts of authors of color, but just while also adding in Latinx and Indigenous authors. And then finally, we have books with disability representation or by disabled authors. Now, so far as disability representation goes, I know that that's going to go up at least a little bit because I'm starting to get more into my HIV and AIDS TBR, and that sort of chronic illness and everything that comes with it would be put kind of into the category of disability. However, I want to do more than kind of just that. I do have a number of disability studies books that I've been wanting to get, so I'll probably invest in those sometime soon. And I need to do more research in looking at disability representation in fiction, and this also includes autism representation. I need to look more at that as well. I've heard of some of the books that get recommended. I just need to get a hold of them. So that's something that I'm looking forward to doing as well. So far as like number of books that I want to get done in the other half of the year, I read 105 in the first 7 months. I think that I've set my Goodreads goal for 200, and that would be nice to get to, but I think I want to prioritize finishing my books and diversifying my books a little bit more, so if I don't get all the way to 200, it's not going to be the end of the world. Additionally, I know that the rest of the year is probably going to be a little bit weird because school is starting back up, and I'm a teacher, and adjusting to online class in the last part of last semester was pretty weird. Hopefully it will be a little bit easier to manage in the upcoming semester, especially since I'm more prepared now. But hopefully that doesn't change my reading too terribly much. That's about all that I have so far as reading goals go. If you have any particular reading goals for the rest of the year, let me know about them down in the comments. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.